I'm a 34-year-old woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood. A couple of weeks ago, I found myself in a situation that I never saw coming. Late one night, I was heading back home after spending some time with friends, and as I was getting out of my car, I saw a young girl wandering on the sidewalk a few houses down. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. She looked a bit lost and was clearly distressed, and even though it was close to midnight, she didn't seem to be looking for a way home or calling for anyone. She was just there, shuffling around aimlessly. I approached her, asking if she was okay. She looked at me with big, tired eyes, but didn't say much. It was clear she needed some sort of help, and leaving her there didn't feel right. After a few moments, she quietly muttered her name, Clara. I coaxed her into coming inside my house, just to get her out of the dark and to figure out what to do next. I tried calling the local authorities to let them know there was a child in need of help, and they told me someone would come over as soon as possible. Clara, meanwhile, sat quietly on the edge of my couch, staring down at her shoes. I have a bit of a soft spot for kids, especially ones in difficult situations. I volunteered in foster care programs before and even helped out at youth centers. Something about Clara's silence just struck me deeply. I couldn't help but feel for her. But as I waited, hours passed and no one showed up to take her. I made a few more calls but was told that, due to some staffing shortages and a high number of active cases, it might be a couple of days before they could send someone over or make arrangements for her placement. They didn't seem to have any record of her or know of any family to contact immediately. So it turned into a temporary arrangement. I set up a small bed for her in the guest room and explained that this was just for a few days until things got sorted out. Clara seemed shy but obedient, listening and nodding without much reaction. But as the days went by, Clara started to warm up a bit. She'd follow me around the house, occasionally asking me questions about my day or what I did for work. Then one morning, she slipped and called me Mom. It was unexpected, and while part of me thought it was sweet, I also felt a little uncomfortable with it. I reminded her that I was just helping her out temporarily, but it didn't seem to register. Days turned into nearly a week, and there was still no word from social services. I was calling almost every day, and each time I was met with vague reassurances about a complicated case and that they were doing their best. Meanwhile, Clara was getting more comfortable in my home. She had started asking if she could help with chores, and I noticed she'd taken to drawing little pictures, usually of the two of us together. I was trying to maintain some boundaries. I made sure she understood that I was not her family, just someone helping out until the authorities could figure things out. But her attachment was growing, and my friends and family started to notice, especially when I mentioned how she'd started calling me Mom more frequently. My friends thought I was getting in too deep, warning me that this situation was getting complicated. But with social services still stalling, I didn't know what else to do. Part of me was concerned, too, especially when I noticed that Clara would sometimes do small things like hide my phone or take little trinkets around the house and tuck them into her backpack. At first, I thought it might just be a child acting out or looking for attention, but it was happening more often. It was then that I decided to reach out to a therapist I'd worked with before, just to get some advice on how to handle the situation without Clara becoming even more attached. The therapist advised me to set clear boundaries and make sure Clara understood that this was a temporary situation. That night, I tried explaining to Clara that this wasn't going to be a permanent setup. She just looked at me with a sad, confused expression. I could tell the message wasn't quite sinking in. The following day, things took a surprising turn. Social services finally called back, but the news wasn't what I expected. They informed me that Clara's background was a bit more complex than they had anticipated and that her case might take longer to resolve. They were struggling to find a foster family that could take her in immediately. With nowhere else for her to go, they asked if I could continue to care for Clara a little longer, until they sorted out a long-term plan. I agreed, but knew this would mean a bigger shift in my daily life. Clara was no longer just a guest in my home. I was adjusting my work schedule, coordinating her school arrangements, and of course dealing with the questions from curious neighbors who started seeing Clara with me regularly. Some even assumed she was my daughter, which didn't help when Clara herself would start calling me Mom more openly, even in public. As the days went on, Clara's behavior became a bit more unsettling. She would sometimes lie about small things, like saying she hadn't seen something she clearly took, or even blaming me when things around the house went missing or broke. The first time it happened, I thought maybe I was overreacting, but the pattern continued. I tried bringing this up in a gentle way, but Clara would get defensive, often avoiding eye contact or walking away. With each day, I was feeling more and more like I was in over my head. I just wanted to help Clara until she had a stable place to go, but it was clear this arrangement was quickly becoming more than I had bargained for. Update 1. After social services told me they needed more time, I decided it was crucial to set boundaries with Clara. So one evening, I tried to sit her down and explain things as clearly as I could. I told her that I was just helping her out temporarily and that eventually she'd be moving in with a family who could care for her long term. She just stared back, quiet and unblinking. Her face scrunched up a bit, and she mumbled something I couldn't quite catch before getting up and going to her room. It didn't feel like the message had really gotten through to her. The next few mornings were different. Clara had settled into a habit of expecting me to help her get ready for school, making her breakfast, and even walking her to the bus stop. She started asking for her meals at specific times, and if I ran even a few minutes late, she'd wait, tapping her foot and watching the clock. It was like she had decided I was her full-time caretaker. I tried suggesting that she could get ready on her own, but it was clear she wasn't listening. Then I started getting calls from her school. They wanted to talk about some things Clara had been saying, which, according to them, raised concerns. Apparently, she'd been telling her classmates and teachers that I was her mother. Not only that, but she'd made it sound like we'd been living together for years. When the school counselor called, she sounded confused, asking if there had been a recent adoption or something. Trying to explain that Clara was just staying with me temporarily felt awkward, especially when it became clear that Clara had shared some rather imaginative stories about us. Meanwhile, social services had gone radio silent. I left messages almost every day, hoping for an update, but the phone calls and emails weren't answered. Each day felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for some assurance that things were being handled. But there was nothing. The financial aspect was also creeping up on me. Clara needed school supplies, lunch money, clothes, and other essentials that I hadn't planned for in my budget. Each little expense added up, making it hard to keep up with my own bills. My savings were slowly draining, and it started to worry me. I'd never realized how quickly these things could pile up. Friends who had been supportive in the beginning were also starting to pull back. Some hinted that Clara might be taking advantage of my kindness. A couple even pointed out that it seemed like I was letting myself be manipulated. They were worried I was in too deep. It didn't help that Clara would sometimes say things like, "You don't love me," or "You'll just leave me like everyone else," whenever I tried to set a boundary. The guilt was overwhelming, and I started feeling stuck, like no matter what I did, I'd end up hurting her. At one point, I thought about asking a friend if Clara could stay with them for a weekend, just so I could catch a breather. But when I mentioned the idea to Clara, she became hysterical. She clung to me, crying and saying she didn't want to go anywhere else. Seeing her like that made it clear that leaving her with someone else, even temporarily, wasn't an option. Things escalated further when her school started calling more frequently. They'd have minor issues like Clara acting out or telling more lies, and every call meant more time away from work. My job was starting to notice, and my manager pulled me aside, mentioning that my performance had slipped and that I needed to be more focused. I could tell I was on thin ice. I spoke to my therapist again, and she warned me that this attachment might not be healthy. She suggested that Clara could be clinging to me for stability, seeking out any sense of family she could find. I needed to take steps to separate myself emotionally, she said, but it was easier said than done. I'd grown attached too. At this point, I reached out to family members, hoping they might be able to help or at least offer some advice. But they weren't comfortable getting involved, mentioning concerns about potential legal issues. They didn't want to be in a position where they'd have to take responsibility if anything went wrong. So it became clear that I was on my own. Desperate for advice, I turned to Reddit. The responses were a mixed bag, but some suggested I consult a lawyer to clarify my rights and ensure I wasn't trapped in an unofficial guardianship. I hadn't thought about it from a legal perspective, but their comments made me realize how complicated this was becoming. Clara wasn't making things any easier. She started telling neighbors that I was her mom, which led to awkward encounters whenever I'd run into someone at the grocery store or around the block. People would give me knowing smiles, congratulating me on my new addition. Correcting them became exhausting, so eventually I just nodded along and moved on. Then one day I found something strange in my room. A small, sentimental bracelet that had belonged to my grandmother was lying broken on my dresser. When I asked Clara about it, she just shrugged and said, "I wanted it to be mine." She didn't even seem remorseful. That small act made me realize just how blurred the lines had become. By this point, I was starting to question everything. Was I doing more harm than good? This situation felt like it was spiraling out of control. Clara's attachment was intense, and I could feel myself getting pulled in further, almost as if her needs had become my responsibility. But I wasn't sure I was equipped to give her the help she really needed. Update 2. A couple of weeks after things started feeling overwhelming, I got a call that shook things up in an unexpected way. A woman introduced herself as a distant relative of Clara's. She claimed she'd just learned about Clara's situation and wanted to check in. She didn't offer much detail, just that she was a second cousin on Clara's father's side and had only recently found out about her being in foster care. But rather than sounding eager to help, her voice was hesitant. After we spoke a bit more, it became clear that she wasn't likely to offer any real support. She danced around questions, asked for more information about Clara's behavior, and then bluntly admitted she wasn't in a position to take her in, citing complications in her own family. Shortly after that call, social services finally contacted me again, though it wasn't exactly helpful. They apologized for the delay and mentioned that they were trying to manage a backlog of cases. However, they didn't have any news on a foster placement for Clara. They encouraged me to hold tight and assured me they'd contact me soon. I wasn't sure what to make of it since soon had already stretched out far beyond what I'd expected. After the relative and social services left me in limbo, Clara's behavior took a noticeable turn. She started testing limits I hadn't even known were there. One evening, I found her in my bedroom, going through my things. She looked up, completely unbothered, and said, "I deserve to know everything about you." It was as if she thought she was entitled to every part of my life. I asked her to stay out of my room, but the way she brushed me off made me realize this boundary would be tough to enforce. At my next therapy session, I shared what had been happening. My therapist became concerned, warning me that the attachment issues seemed to be escalating. She strongly suggested I start distancing myself emotionally, otherwise it would only encourage Clara to push boundaries even further. The warning seemed almost prophetic because soon after, Clara started having frequent emotional outbursts. She would cry and scream, saying she didn't want to be abandoned. The breakdowns happened more often, and they usually ended with her clinging to me, refusing to let go. Not long after that, I got a call from her school counselor. Clara had been telling the staff that I was planning to abandon her, spinning stories of her past that painted her as a constantly rejected child. The counselor was concerned, hinting that I might need to give Clara more emotional support, but all I could think was that I was already at my limit. It was clear she was finding ways to increase her hold on me, whether at home or through what she shared at school. Realizing that this was going far beyond what I could handle alone, I decided to consult a lawyer. I wanted to understand what my rights were since Clara's behavior suggested she wasn't ready, or even willing, to leave. The lawyer was straightforward, explaining that without an official guardianship, I wasn't legally bound to Clara, but without intervention, there was a risk I'd end up responsible for her by default. He suggested getting in touch with social services again to push for an immediate placement. The situation took a turn for the worse when I took Clara with me to a local store to pick up a few things. Out of nowhere, she threw herself onto the floor, clutching my leg and calling me mom, loudly begging me not to leave her behind. People started staring, and one woman nearby shook her head in disapproval, muttering about neglect. I tried to calm Clara down, but she refused to let go, creating a scene that lasted until we left. It felt like everyone in that store was judging me, assuming the worst. It didn't help that my neighbors were also starting to chime in. Apparently, word had gotten around, and some neighbors had decided that I was failing Clara emotionally. I'd even overheard a couple of them discussing how a child doesn't act like that for no reason. They couldn't know how many times I'd tried setting boundaries, or that Clara's attachment was becoming unhealthy, but that didn't stop them from judging. My job wasn't sympathetic either. After the 5th call from Clara's school in 2 weeks, my manager took me aside and pointed out how I'd missed several important deadlines. She warned me that if I didn't get my personal life under control, it could affect my position. I could see where things were heading, and I knew I couldn't afford to lose my job over this situation. Desperate, I turned to Reddit again for advice. This time, people urged me to take more drastic action, even suggesting that I consider involving the police if Clara refused to leave. Some thought I'd gone above and beyond already, and that I should start taking firmer steps to protect myself. It was the nudge I needed to consider something more drastic. One night, after yet another emotional meltdown from Clara, I hit a breaking point. It was like all the pressure and stress finally reached a peak. My therapist later called it an emotional breakdown, but at that moment I just felt cornered, like there was no way out. I couldn't keep going like this, pretending I could handle things alone when it was clear I was in over my head. At my next session, my therapist warned me one last time. If I didn't make a decisive change, this attachment could end up causing even more harm to Clara than letting her go. She urged me to take concrete steps to push for a foster placement, for both Clara's well-being and my own. It was after that talk that I decided I had to call social services again and push harder this time. I knew Clara wouldn't understand, and I braced myself for the inevitable fallout, but I also knew I was at my breaking point. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for the situation to fix itself while both of our lives became even more entangled. Update 3. After making countless calls to social services, I was finally connected with a family interested in fostering Clara. They were experienced and had fostered other children before, so they felt confident they could manage her needs. Arrangements were made for Clara to meet them at their home one Saturday afternoon. I took her over, hoping this transition would give her the support she needed, but things didn't go as planned. As soon as we arrived, Clara's behavior changed. She turned quiet, watching the foster parents with a cold, distant stare, refusing to respond to their questions or engage at all. The foster parents were patient, trying different ways to get through to her, but Clara wouldn't budge. When they offered her snacks and suggested showing her around their house, she crossed her arms, muttered a barely audible no, and kept staring at the floor. After an uncomfortable hour, I drove her back, feeling frustrated but also uncertain about what this meant for her future placement. Later that night, Clara told me she didn't want to live with strangers. She didn't want another mom. She wanted to stay with me, and when I reminded her that I wasn't her family, she got quiet. The next morning, things escalated. When I tried to leave for work, Clara blocked the front door, wrapping her arms around it tightly, refusing to let me go. I tried to move her aside gently, but she clung on, starting to cry. I had to call my work and let them know I'd be late again. Eventually, after prying Clara away from the door, I sat her down and told her that if she couldn't respect the boundaries I'd set, I'd have no choice but to involve authorities to help her find a safe place. This seemed to surprise her. She looked at me in disbelief, then ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. I felt awful about saying it, but I didn't know what else to do. At my next therapy session, I told my therapist about everything that had happened, including the feelings of guilt that had started creeping in. I wondered if somewhere along the way, I'd grown attached too. She reminded me that Clara's dependency wasn't my fault and encouraged me to keep pursuing a solution for Clara's sake and my own. Things got more complicated when my family found out. They started calling, saying it was selfish to push Clara away when she clearly needed someone stable in her life. Some even accused me of abandoning her. Trying to explain the strain Clara's behavior was putting on my life didn't change their minds. They saw her as a vulnerable child, and to them I was being too harsh. I decided to ask the police for help, hoping they might offer some guidance on how to handle the situation. But when they arrived and assessed the situation, they told me their hands were tied. They couldn't remove a child from a home unless there was a serious, immediate danger to her or to others. Clara wasn't harming anyone, they said, so there wasn't much they could do. One day, while running an errand, Clara threw another public fit. She latched onto my arm, crying loudly that I was going to leave her. People around us stared, some with pity, others with judgment. I could see the concerned glances and hear the murmurs. A few people even came up, asking if everything was all right. All I could do was try to calm her down enough to get us out of there, feeling like the whole world was watching and misinterpreting the situation. Work wasn't any easier. My boss had noticed the ongoing disruptions and was clearly losing patience. She asked me to figure out a solution fast, as my performance had slipped too far already. I knew my job was at risk, and the added stress only deepened my frustration. Just when things seemed impossible, our story somehow reached the local news. They called, wanting an interview. I didn't even know how they'd heard about it, but they seemed eager to cover the story, asking questions about my experience as an unofficial foster parent. Suddenly, Claire and I were the subject of local gossip, with people speculating about what was really going on. I started getting mixed reactions online as well, especially on Reddit. Some people empathized, while others accused me of being irresponsible for allowing things to get this far. After the first failed placement, social services eventually found another family willing to take Clara in. This family was aware of Clara's history and seemed willing to work through the challenges, though they admitted they were a bit nervous. We arranged for another meeting, and I spent a lot of time explaining to Clara why this family would be a good fit for her. The night before she was supposed to leave, I tried talking to her about the transition. Clara's reaction was immediate, her face twisted with anger, and she stomped off, slamming doors and refusing to speak. Her silence was unsettling, but I knew that I couldn't let her attachment keep her here forever. The next day, the new foster family arrived, and I watched as Clara reluctantly gathered her things. She kept her eyes on the floor, ignoring everyone around her. As she walked out, she paused at the door, looking back at me with a mixture of hurt and betrayal. I tried to offer her a comforting smile, but she quickly turned away, refusing to look back as she got into their car. The house felt eerily empty once she was gone. It was strange, feeling both relieved and guilty at the same time. I had spent weeks trying to help her, adjusting my entire life to accommodate her, but now that she was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow let her down. I kept replaying the last look she'd given me, wondering if I'd made the right choice. As the days passed, I tried focusing on rebuilding my routine and regaining some stability, but the thought of Clara lingered. Part of me hoped she'd find happiness and stability in her new home, but another part couldn't shake the nagging question: had I done enough? Or had I just passed the problem to someone else? Update 4. In the days after Clara left, the house felt hollow. Without her presence, the quiet felt almost unnatural. I went about my daily routine, trying to refocus on work and get back into a rhythm, but everything reminded me of her: the extra toothbrush in the bathroom, a stray drawing of a stick figure family she'd left behind. It was hard to shake the feeling that I'd left her hanging, even though I knew I'd done what I could. Friends who'd heard about the situation encouraged me to move on, telling me I'd done enough. A few even seemed frustrated, reminding me that Clara wasn't my responsibility and that I'd gone above and beyond. But their words didn't erase the nagging sense that I'd abandoned someone who'd come to rely on me. Even with all the challenges, letting go of that responsibility left a strange emptiness. Therapy helped me process the waves of guilt, although the progress felt slower than I'd hoped. My therapist reminded me that Clara had needed a stable family from the start, not just a temporary caretaker. Still, the guilt lingered, sometimes surfacing unexpectedly. Nights were the hardest. I'd wake up from dreams where I saw Clara crying, calling out for me. These recurring nightmares started affecting my sleep, adding another layer to the toll the whole situation had taken on me. Social services called to update me a couple of weeks later. They informed me that Clara was adjusting to her new foster family, though they couldn't say for sure how long the placement would last. It was a relief to know she hadn't been moved again, but the uncertainty weighed on me. I knew from past experiences with foster kids that some placements didn't last, and the idea of Clara bouncing from home to home tugged at me, reopening the wounds I was trying to close. Meanwhile, word of Clara's departure seemed to spread around the neighborhood. I started noticing sidelong glances from neighbors, along with whispers and awkward encounters. Some people seemed to view me as cold-hearted, and a few even avoided me outright, likely imagining that I'd cast out a child in need. The judgment was subtle but persistent. A couple of neighbors even made offhand comments, mentioning Clara in a way that made me feel like I was being scrutinized. They didn't understand the full story, and explaining myself felt impossible. Around this time, I found some relief online, where I could anonymously share my experiences without judgment. On Reddit, people reached out with empathy, telling me I'd done what I could. Some even shared similar stories of attachment issues with foster children, letting me know I wasn't alone. The community there helped me see the situation from a different angle, offering support that I couldn't find in my own life. Despite everything, my work life slowly started to stabilize. With fewer distractions, I was able to get back into the swing of things. My boss seemed pleased that my performance was improving, though the whole experience had left its mark. I couldn't completely shake the feeling that I'd left something unresolved, and that lingering guilt sometimes crept into my focus, especially during quieter moments at work. Then, unexpectedly, I ran into Clara one afternoon at a local event. She was there with her foster family, holding onto the hand of a woman who seemed kind and gentle. Clara looked different, a bit more grown up, and there was a calmness about her that I hadn't seen before. She glanced over and recognized me, but her expression was distant. There was no sign of the fierce attachment she once had. Instead, she looked at me like a familiar face from a past life, nodding politely before looking away. That brief encounter brought up a flood of mixed emotions. Part of me felt relief seeing her doing well, while another part ached with memories of the time we'd shared. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd left any lasting impact, or if I was just a temporary figure in her life who'd come and gone. The meeting stirred up more questions than answers, and I took it back to my therapist, who reminded me that closure would come with time. The support I continued to find online was a lifeline, with people reminding me that attachment is rarely straightforward. Others who'd fostered or taken in children temporarily shared their stories of letting go, helping me make peace with the fact that sometimes the best intentions don't lead to perfect outcomes. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message from my family. They reached out with a tentative apology, admitting they hadn't fully understood the stress and complexities of Clara's stay. They told me they realized now that I'd been trying to do the right thing, even though they hadn't seen it that way at the time. While it didn't erase the hurt from before, the apology felt like a small step toward healing. As time passed, life started feeling more balanced. The weight of guilt lightened, bit by bit, and I found myself moving forward. Clara's absence felt less like a void and more like a chapter that had closed, albeit imperfectly. Her drawings and a few other small items still lay tucked away in a box, a reminder of our time together and everything I'd learned from it. Each time I looked at them, I felt a mix of sadness and gratitude, appreciating the lessons in compassion and boundaries. With distance, I started to forgive myself, accepting that I'd done what I could in a complex situation. Clara's attachment to me had been intense, but I could see now that it hadn't been entirely about me. It was about her need for stability, something I couldn't fully provide. The memories lingered, but instead of haunting me, they began to serve as a reminder of the value in helping, even when the outcome isn't what you hope for. In the end, I realized that even though things hadn't worked out as I'd wanted, my intentions had always been to help. That gave me a sense of closure, knowing that while the journey had been difficult, it had also brought me a deeper understanding of what it means to give, to let go, and to forgive both others and myself. Update 5. Months after Clara left, I thought the chapter had fully closed. But one morning, I received a small envelope in the mail. It was from social services, and inside was a short letter from Clara. She'd written, in large, unsteady handwriting, that she missed me. It wasn't long or detailed, just a few sentences, but she mentioned how she thought about me often and hoped I was doing well. Reading those words took me by surprise. I hadn't expected to hear from her again, and the simplicity of her message stirred up emotions I'd thought I'd moved past. I took the letter to my therapist, hoping for some guidance on how to interpret it. She encouraged me to see it as a positive sign, a small but meaningful indicator that Clara was processing her experience and perhaps even finding a way to express her feelings healthily. My therapist suggested that the letter might be a good step in Clara's journey, a way for her to work through the transition she'd gone through. It brought up the idea of replying, but part of me was cautious, not wanting to reopen old attachments. I knew I needed to handle this carefully, so I consulted a lawyer to understand the best way forward. He advised me that if I wanted to respond, I should do so through social services. They would be able to facilitate any exchanges, ensuring Clara's placement wasn't disrupted. It made sense, but the idea of opening up a new line of contact worried me. Still, after considering it for a few days, I decided to reach out to social services for their input. When I spoke with them, they suggested that limited, occasional contact might be helpful for Clara, as long as it stayed simple and reassuring. They thought a short reply could help her feel settled and allow her some closure. So, I sat down and drafted a response, letting her know that I was happy to hear from her, and encouraging her to do her best in her new home. I wrote that I was proud of her and that I believed she would find happiness in her new family. The letter was short, but I hoped it would offer her some comfort. A few weeks after I sent the letter, social services reached out again with a positive update. Clara was doing well in her placement, actively participating in school, and even starting to make friends. Hearing that brought a strange mix of joy and sadness. I was relieved to know she was adjusting, yet there was a bittersweet feeling too. The connection we'd shared was gone, replaced by something more distant, a reminder of the bond we'd almost had. I turned to Reddit again, where I'd shared so much of this story. The community was invested, and many responded with encouragement, sharing their own experiences with complex attachments. They helped me see that sometimes, the most compassionate choice is letting go, even when it's difficult. But as the post gained traction, it attracted a few negative comments too. Some accused me of abandonment, questioning my commitment. Although most people were supportive, the few harsh responses stung. It made me question myself briefly, but the majority of comments helped me find a sense of validation. With time, I focused on my career and friendships again, slowly building back the stability that had been disrupted. Work became more manageable, and my boss seemed to notice the improvement. Friends who'd kept their distance during the chaos of Clara's stay began reaching out, helping me reconnect and return to a sense of normalcy. But despite the progress, my experience with Clara left a lasting impression, and I found myself reflecting on what I'd learned about boundaries and compassion. As weeks turned into months, the emotional turbulence gradually settled. The memory of Clara no longer weighed on me like before, and I felt a sense of peace knowing I'd done what I could under difficult circumstances. The fleeting moments of doubt still surfaced occasionally, but I'd grown to accept that our connection, however imperfect, had its purpose. Clara had needed someone, and I'd been there in the moment. That was enough. The letter she'd sent and my reply stayed tucked away in a small box, a reminder of the experience and everything it had taught me. In the end, Clara's presence had shown me the delicate balance between helping others and protecting myself. I'd come to see that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary for both of us to grow. Life moved forward, and though Clara was no longer part of it, the lessons from that time stayed with me, shaping how I approached relationships and challenges. My time with Clara taught me that even brief connections can leave a deep impact, and sometimes, letting go is the best way to help someone thrive. When I revisited my Reddit post months later, I found that people continued to respond, sharing their thoughts, stories, and insights. It felt like a full circle, knowing that Clara's story had touched others, sparking conversations about attachment, boundaries, and compassion. In the end, I realized that while Clara and I had only crossed paths for a short time, the journey had been one of growth for both of us. And though it was bittersweet, it was a chapter one could close with a sense of acceptance, grateful for the lessons I'd learned along the way.